Welcome once more. My name is Vanessa Lopez, and I'm going to go ahead and start in today on culturally and linguistically appropriate special education eligibility assessment processes. This is day 3, as I mentioned, of the Build Your Toolkit series, Take and Go resources for practitioners serving dually identified students. We already took part in day 1 and 2. If you have not had an opportunity to participate live, know that those are available and archived on our website, as will this session, with follow-up sessions 4 and 5 coming up in March and May, respectively. So let's move forward to day 3 session outcomes, as we have a brief 60 minutes to get in as deep as possible. On session 3 outcomes, we want to be able to make sure that we have covered as much as possible from the assessment process guide to assist multidisciplinary teams with evaluating current practices related to special education eligibility assessment of culturally and linguistically diverse students. As you know, the setup of this session, this series that we've developed, it's about unpacking one single resource and finding ways to apply it in our practice, whether it be as a member of a community of practice, a person running a professional learning community, or just to build your individual expertise. Let's go ahead and move on to the QR code for today's resources. By scanning this QR code or typing in that bit.ly address, you should be able to access the resources that we are going to be sharing today. The resources shared today are in the form of the slide deck. All links are included within that slide deck to all the resources that we'll be referencing today. Should the link not work, just drop it in the chat, and I'll be sure that once we are done with our time together today, I go in and remediate any issues that might have arisen in accessing the resources. Again, I'm going to leave the QR code up for a couple more seconds and the bit.ly link so that you can access today's slide deck. And as you may have noticed, I am navigating solo today. The rest of my fantastic team members are not here with me today, as they are busy with other meetings and responsibilities. So today you get me, Vanessa Lopez, coordinator here at Imperial County SELPA, one of the project managers for Project Muse, improving outcomes from multilingual students with exceptional needs. Christina is at State SELPA. Debbie is with her current district right now, Oceanside, fulfilling her roles as a special education director, and Lupita is at one of our meetings with one of our other local sites. So we are part of the Special Education Resource Leads. If you've been with us day 1 and day 2, we've shared a little bit about how we engage as being capacity builders, connectors, facilitators within part of the statewide system of support. We are one of many statewide agencies that provide supports on all things related to our students and improving outcomes, with the special education content leads that are related specifically to supporting students with disabilities who are also English learners. You see here that there are additional agencies, EWIG grantees, capacity building leads that are also available with resources and times to connect statewide. Note that a lot of the resources and the references that we make today are from our flagship resource, the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. And unless otherwise stated, none of these best practices are binding, except of course for statutes, regulations, and court decisions referenced within the document. That being said, let's quickly jump in to set the context. So we know that in the state of California, which is vast with a diverse student population, we know that multilingual learners are present across the education system in all of our work. 6 out of 10 children ages 0 to 5 are dual language learners. 1 in 4 are socioeconomically disadvantaged students that are also English learners, and 1 in 4 students with disabilities are also English learners. So we see a lot of that intersectionality within our student population. And also, we know that it's important to recognize that there has been really a consistent uptick in identification of students with disabilities ages 0 through 22 statewide. However, as we narrow our focus into dually identified students, we make reference often at about how around 24 to 25% of students with disabilities are English learners. That's important to keep in mind as we focus in today on this one resource, which is all about linguistically and culturally relevant and appropriate assessment practices, in keeping in mind and focused in the fact that our multilingual learner terminology is important to focus in on. We know that we have dual language learner in preschools and pre-K. We know that the English learner terminology, EL, as most of us are familiar with, is typically applied in TK-12, but we also know that there is lifelong language learning following reclassifications. I like to use myself as an example. My primary language, my home language was Spanish, and I will always be a lifelong language learner. And I would venture to say that many of us are lifelong language learners when we focus in on the specific language that is related to a particular discipline that we are exploring and learning that we might not be necessarily familiar or fluent with. Also, when you hear some of the terminology related to long-term English learners at risk of becoming long-term English learners, I think it's important for us to really have at least a cursory understanding of what we mean when we say long-term English learner and LTEL. And not just see the acronym and not know what is attached to the acronym, but a long-term English learner is an English learner who has been enrolled 6 or more years without making any progress and without making any progress in their English language proficiency. Whereas a student who's at risk is a student who has been enrolled 4 or 5 years without making significant progress. So just by the year 6 plus and 4 to 5 years, we know that the vast majority of our sense of urgency is found in middle school and high school as it relates to long-term English learners. We know that some of our conversations around where are long-term English learners made oftentimes point back to the elementary school years, not necessarily as they are the ones responsible, but just chronologically, that's where it happens, right? They end up spending their primary elementary school years trying to develop the language. And again, we know that that's dependent on a variety of variables, but we know that that is part of the conversation. So as I move forward to the next slide, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to really process and digest the information that is presented here. So let me orient you to this graph, well, these two graphs, so that we can process a little bit together. So you see two pie graphs here. One is for English learners, the other one is for English learners with disabilities. If you've been to session 1 and 2, you've seen this graph before. If this is your first time here with us, please take some time to consider the following data points. So when we see this blue section on the reclassified fluent English proficient section of the pie chart for English learners, we see that that's at 45%. Now I'm going to invite you over to the pie graph across, which is for English learners with disabilities, and take a look at that 28.30 RFIP percent. So without reading every single data point here in the slide, I'm going to step back, give you a couple of seconds, and invite you to open up your chat and share what jumps out at you. There are no wrong answers here. This is a brave space where we share and we learn. I'm looking forward to see what you drop in the chat. Take a couple of seconds. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Drop that in the chat for me. Numbers are disproportionate. Agree? Especially if we're looking at RFEP and then long-term English learner, right? Yes, students with disabilities, yes, Erin, are more likely to be long-term English learners. And I'm wondering why that is. Less reclassified students in special education? One of the things that I notice also is that there is some similarity in the EL 0 to 3 years, meaning that they've been English learners for 0 to 3. So here, These are students that have been English learners for 0 to 3 years only, meaning these are typically if they enrolled in TK or kinder first or second grade students. So not necessarily that they're 0 to 3-year-olds. Designated ELD? Right. Yes. Fantastic questions, fantastic points to ponder and consider. Thank you everyone for engaging. I know that really connecting with all of you through the chat is a very great way to see what the thinking is out there in the field. And let me tell you that a lot of your reflections in the chat are very much consistent with what we hear from participants to a lot of our PDN who engage in questions related to dually identified students. So again, no shocker, we know that in the state of California, when we're looking at home languages of English learners with disabilities in California, overwhelmingly it's Spanish. However, we know that Arabic, Vietnamese, Filipino, Cantonese, Mandarin follow, with all other non-English languages, including dialects, follow suit. Around 7.2% are included there. So in the past, we've talked about the percentage, the top 3 disability categories in the state of California. Relevant specifically today because we are going to be focusing in on the resource for culturally and linguistically responsive and appropriate assessment practices. So when we're looking at SLD, speech specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, SLI, and autism, this is the percentage of students within these disability categories who are English learners. So roughly around 75 to 80% of our students qualify for special education services under these 3 disability categories as English learners. So if we move forward, I want to point out to the fact that many of you are here as an English learner TOSA, an ELD teacher, a special education teacher, as an administrator. And let me tell you, you're in the right place because this level of work, the work related to dually identified students, is truly a team lift. And the way we best engage in the work is by engaging in a team lift approach. Prior sessions have focused in on MTSS. We focused in also on the tiers of intervention, but today we're going to be looking past the pre-referral process. Now we're going to be focusing in on section 4, 5, and 6 of the referral process. I want to point out that this is not a pathway or a how to get somewhere, right? This is just pointing out the process that we typically engage in when we are looking at the pre-referral to SPED referral process. It's not that we need to follow steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to get our students to special education, but more of a process to consider and think about as we move along. So let's jump into it. I mentioned that the top 3 disability categories for English learners are SLD, SLI, and autism. And oh boy, do we love our acronyms in special education. And sometimes it's really hard to not want to get into the weeds about what the disability categories really mean, but it's important that we at least focus in our attention on those top 3, at least for the time that we have together today. So SLD being by and far the largest percentage, 43.64, is important for us to understand what it is and what it isn't. So SLD is one of 13 distinct disability categories under which students can meet eligibility to receive special education services. Some of our kiddos have a primary disability and a secondary disability, and then additional ones as well, right? So let's talk a little bit about SLD. So when we're talking about SLD, we're talking about a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. Those processes that are involved in understanding, using language, whether it be spoken or written, and that is typically manifested in the, we love this phrase here, imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations that might be inclusive of conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So a couple of things here that I want to point out is that imperfect ability, right? Well, who has a perfect ability? However, we're talking about a disorder. So the imperfect ability is coupled with a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. I also want to point out that contrary to popular belief, dyslexia is not a disability category in and of its own, but it lives under SLD. And another point to call out is that a dyslexia diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that an IEP is required. We know that there are additional supports that can be provided by the use of a 504, but that's a topic for another day. Just wanted to get a couple of things out there that might be percolating. So now, why is it that so many of our English learners qualify for special education services under SLD? Well, it typically happens because when a referral is made, we have a child who may be struggling with oral expression, written expression, listening comprehension, basic reading skills, etc., ad nauseum. Well, for many of our English learners, depending where they are in their language acquisition journey, language development journey, there might be some level of difficulty in any one of these areas. So when we get a referral for special education assessment or for the SST process, it might be that people thinking, well, you know what, I remember seeing that SLD means that kiddos are having difficulty in any one of these areas, and this child definitely is having difficulty in those areas. Follow my drift? Why it might be so easy to make a referral. However, there is an important piece that we want to consider. Through the assessment process, especially if the assessment process is culturally and linguistically relevant and appropriate, we need to make that determination based on those results that there is a discrepancy that is related to attention, visual processing, auditory processing, phonological processing, sensory motor skills, or cognitive abilities. Cognitive abilities may include association, conceptualization, and expression, meaning that the presence of this alone doesn't necessarily indicate that there's a disability. So just as it is important for us to know what it is to have a specific learning disability, it's important for us to also know what is not a learning disability. Okay, so these are exclusionary factors, right? So limited school experience or poor school attendance, that is not a specific learning disability. Environmental, cultural difference, or economic disadvantage are not a specific learning disability. Intellectual disability or emotional disturbance are not a specific learning disability. Rather, they are disability categories of their own. And most importantly, limited English proficiency. I saw many of you reflecting in the chat, wondering about what designated ELD might look like for students with disabilities. That's a great question. And in conversation with other practitioners statewide, we hear that this is they're wondering prior to even being identified as a student with a disability, as they're sitting in that SST process, as they're sitting in that pre-referral activity. What has designated ELD looked like for this student? What has integrated ELD looked like for the student? Has that instruction been consistent, of sufficient quality, etc., etc.? Any thoughts on SLD? I'll give you a couple of seconds to pause, reflect, and share any thoughts in the chat. I'm wondering how many of you have been walked through what SLD is, what a specific learning disability is? Yeah, so it's really important for us to spend some time understanding what a disability is and what it is, and specifically SLD. We know that if a team determines that limited school experience or poor school attendance, environmental cultural difference or economic disadvantage, intellectual disability or emotional disturbance, or limited English proficiency are the primary contributors, then it is not a disability. That in and of itself becomes an exclusionary factor. So when we are talking about intellectual disability or emotional disturbance, if that is in fact an area of concern related to a referral for assessment to determine if special education is appropriate for the student, that has its own sets of assessments that your school psychologist will determine which assessment batteries to use to determine that. However, when we're looking at attendance, school experience, cultural factors, or limited English proficiency, we are then having to look at an additional data set to determine if these are in fact primary contributors or not. The second disability category that we are going to be just briefly going over right now is autism. We know that autism is a developmental disability where a lot of our students may engage in repetitive activities, stereotype movements, resistance to environmental change or changes in their routines, have some sensory issues, whether they be sensory input or sensory output issues. However, I want to caution us to go above and beyond those stereotyped really characteristics for autism, because as the saying goes, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. So we know that our younger students are oftentimes coming into our school system, whether it be TK or kinder, with an autism diagnosis. And it might seem to us that there is an uptick in autism diagnosis, and that would in fact be consistent with what the data indicates. However, it's important for us to recognize that although 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, there is still some difference between our students and how it is that their disability manifests. 31% of children with ASD have an intellectual disability, meaning that their intelligence quotient is below 70. So 31%, 25% of these students are in the borderline range, with 44% having IQ scores in the average to above average range. So critical points to keep in mind, because not all students with an autism diagnosis have a secondary diagnosis related to intellectual disability. And that makes the assessment process critical, because we know that with autism, like with SLD, there may be some language implications in how that disability manifests. And then finally, we come to SLI, speech language impairment. And that typically is associated with a communication disorder such as stuttering, articulation impairments, language impairments, or voice impairments that negatively or adversely impact a child's academic performance. Now, when we look at this slide here, as that points out how some of these attributes are manifested, I want you to think about English learners, and typically what our English learners areas of need are when they come to our SST process and perhaps our pre-referral and our assessment process for special education services. So speech and or language skills that are noticeably behind their peers, an inability to express ideas, improper use of words and their meanings, receptive language disorders that may manifest with difficulty understanding what is said to them, and so on and so forth. So, if we consider these attributes and sometimes what our English learners manifest in our classroom, we can see why there might be some need to really tease out the idea of, is it a language difference or is it a disability? And the only way we can begin to disentangle that is by engaging in culturally and linguistically appropriate special education eligibility assessment processes. So I spent some time going over those top 3 disability categories for English learners, because here is where the relevance of the assessment instruments really comes into play. So we are looking at this one resource today. And the one resource is this process guide. This process guide was developed to support teams and really just not necessarily using this as a to-do checklist, but rather a reflective process. How it is that we engage in determining whether our assessment practices are culturally and linguistically appropriate for all of our multilingual students. So here we go with the data gathering phase. Let's jump into it. So when we are looking at the data gathering phase of our assessment process, here we start with gathering a random sample of assessment reports, whether they be those included in the psychoeducational assessment reports, speech or language reports, multidisciplinary reports, any of these tools that might be necessary to start developing that robust student profile. And I know it can be a dig to go through all of that good stuff. So to walk us through that process, if you have access to the slide deck, you should be able to pop open some of the appendices that I'm going to open up for you. So when we are in that data gathering section, we want to determine what is the relevant information. In the pre-referral process, we talked about doing a CUME file deep dive. Say that you were not part of that process or that that step wasn't done. Well, guess what? We have additional resources that are available here to you in the forms of these appendices that help you collect relevant data to start building that robust student profile. From English learner extrinsic factors to the parent questionnaire to gather parent information, guardian information, and also that of the English learners' teachers. And you can do 1 form, 2 forms, as many as you like. Know that these appendices are available for you to pop open, download, save, or print to best fit your needs as you go back to the data gathering process. Again, if you're already engaged in that special education eligibility assessment process, you will have access to these reports and these additional tools to start building this file, this compendium of information to help us make a determination that our decision at the end upon going through this entire reflective process is really appropriate. So moving forward, we also have additional observational data gathering tools. We have a classroom observation checklist, also an instructional observation form, and then another form that is honed in on information reported by the parent to utilize in the IEP development, whether or not the student meets eligibility criteria. We know that it is important for us to gather information from the parent to help us make these determinations. However, I want to point out that it's never dependent on only one resource, because we also want to review additional assessment materials. And here's where we get to section 3 of the process of the reflection guide. When we are here thinking about, okay, so I have the psychoeducational report that was developed by the school psychologist that includes data from multiple assessment tools and protocols. I have the ed specialist's academic assessment to determine where there might be some academic gaps if that's an area of concern. Perhaps it's even the student is maybe being considered for adapted physical education because there is a secondary concern related to an orthopedic impairment, etc. Gathering all of that. However, we know that oftentimes that is not enough because our student groups are not monolithic. Here we're talking specifically about students with a potential disability who are English learners, but just students in general. Are diverse, right? So we want to consider the diverse and cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our students that might be impacting how it is that some of these evaluation practices are read and utilized. And we also want to make sure that we're not reliant on only one single generous intelligent quotient to make a determination as to where the student is. So to explore this a little bit further, I want to pop open the actual resource. So let me go ahead and pop this open, and I'm going to open up our website. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. And I'm going to go to infographics just so that you know where to find it. So I went to resources, then infographics, clicked on that, took me to this page in case you want to explore additional infographics later. I'm going to scroll down past our chapter by chapter companions. This page has a slow load, but we're moving. And then I'm going to get to section 2, pre-referral and referral assessment and IEP process. This is the flowchart we used in session 2, and this is the resource that we're sharing with you today. So I'm going to pop that open so that we can see exactly what is in the document. So I started with part 1, 2, and right now went into 3 and 4. And I want to orient you to where those resources are, because I know that it's easy once we're done with a session to just either not remember where our fabulous notes end up or where to find some of the resources that we heard about. So you'll see that this guide, this process map, infographic, whatever you want to call it, is available to you in 5 pages. Okay. It's downloadable, printable. However, if you use it electronically, then you're able to pop open the live links included. We briefly touched on the data gathering sample, how it is that we go through that Cume file, how we might build additional tools to collect relevant information, how to examine required elements. Did we select and administer an assessment that is not racially or culturally biased? What assessments were available? Was the assessment done by a trained person? But then we also talked about collecting additional information that might be relevant to a student whose primary language is one other than English. So with that in mind, I want us to pop open Appendix 4.1 because I want you to know that there is actually a list of potential bilingual assessment tools. Now, this list is not exhaustive, but it is a starting point for us to consider what is out there for our bilingual students. If we think back to the graph that I shared where Spanish is the largest percentage of home language other than English, that is going to help inform the why related to why are there bilingual assessments mostly in Spanish. However, here I want you to see that there are other tools out there that are potentially appropriate for students who are multilingual learners. We see the test name and publisher, the age and grade span, and a brief description. This first section is all about language assessment tools. Section 2 is about cognitive assessment tools. Section 3 is about nonverbal cognitive assessment tools. bilingual social emotional related assessments, academic bilingual assessments, speech and language assessment tools, and so on and so forth. So again, as I mentioned, not exhaustive, but a good starting point to start looking at what else might be out there. Additionally, we want to ensure that this is inclusive of a meaningful conversation with parents, and also with language that is conducive to understanding what it is that is being suggested and or requested in that assessment process. So going back to our slide deck, I'm going to toggle back and forth here. I want to give you some time to pose some questions related to what we've covered up until now. I know that a lot of this information can be new learning for many of us, and we might need some time to process what's being presented and to ask those questions related to the tools that are here. So I want to give you a minute to go ahead and use the chat and share with me some questions and or reflections. Lupita, if you can help me sort through some of those comments that are popping up.
Not a question, just a comment. Appreciation for the resources and the user readiness of them. Thank you so much for that feedback. We were happy to know that the resources we're creating are useful and practical.
And something that I do want to highlight is that I love to talk about the power of one, right? The power of one in action and all the things that we do, but also the power of one in just selecting one resource. We know that we sort of cheated by saying that we're presenting one resource and it's this guide with so many links. But know that just familiarizing yourself with one of the resources within this process is going to give you so much in understanding, whether it be just finally sitting down and looking at the definition of SLD, or just providing one of your assessor peers the list of potential bilingual assessments, or that questionnaire on how to engage with parents. Focus in on the one thing you can walk away with, or the one thing you can share, because it can be a tad overwhelming. So if we look back to the assessment, culturally linguistically appropriate assessment practices, that process that will help us get there, we know that there is a lot of emphasis on assessing in the student's primary language. So let's talk about this openly. The first best option will always be to administer cross-cultural, non-discriminatory assessments that align to the referral concerns, regardless of language difference, in a standardized manner in English. Okay, so that is the first best option. We know that if the student has a primary language other than English, we are going to make all effort to assess in the student's primary language. We know that it can't be just reliant on one assessment. We know that we're going to engage in structured interviews with parents, staff, insert appendices that I shared in the earlier slides related to parents and teachers. We are also going to go in and observe in varied environments. Again, the appendices 4.2, 4.5, and 4.7. We are also going to collect data from curriculum-based and criterion-based assessment to validate potential areas of concern and strength as compared to like peers, right? First best option, pie in the sky, what we all aim and strive for. And that is related to those potential bilingual assessment tools, right? However, we know that at times, it may not be feasible to engage in the first best option. We recognize that. We recognize that for some of you, you might be serving students whose home languages are above and beyond Spanish, English, and Cantonese, Mandarin, Filipino, but rather you have a very diverse population that is rich with different languages and dialects that don't even figure in that percentage pie graph. So for situations like that, we want to be able to provide some level of information for you to consider in establishing what your second option might be, what your third option might be, or what your fourth option might be. And again, this determination committed between you and your site administrator or whoever your assessment team is. Always engaging in your local assessment multidisciplinary team to be clear on the options that were selected and the why. The second option here is to use a trained interpreter and administer the primary language assessment under the supervision of a licensed assessor and document the limitations. Second option, if that first best option isn't available. Another option, the third option, might be to perhaps use an interpreter who speaks the primary language to provide an oral translation of the assessments that are normed and written in English. However, we want to ensure that in this third option, we also document any limitations and to make sure that we do not report the standardized test scores, but rather document the patterns of strengths and weakness. And then finally, the fourth option is if that's all you have, and second option was not an option, third option was not an option, then assess in English. But also include the nonverbal areas of cognition. And if the student in fact shows low cognitions or there are patterns of weakness, attempt to validate that with non-standardized data collection. Again, those observational tools that I shared earlier in the slides past, but are also included in the infographic. There are many ways for teams to gather relevant, recent information and data to support a determination to make any type of recommendation to the IEP team so that the team in conjunction can come to consensus and determine if special education is in fact something that the student requires. Now, a couple of words of caution if you are using interpreters for bilingual assessments. So if you're using an interpreter, critical to prepare. Prior to even beginning the assessment process, you want some time with your interpreter. You want to spend some time knowing what tests are going to be administered. You want to prepare them and yourself to let them know that the assessment might take extra time and ensure that the interpreter speaks the same dialect as the student. We also want to ensure that only the tests that the interpreter has been trained to assist in are administered. And that after the assessment process and also in the before assessment process, you have opportunities to debrief these preparation sessions. Because it's really the conjunction of all of these practices and all of these resources that allow us to be sensitive to culture and language, as this figures largely in making that final recommendation and determination. When you are seeking to build your understanding related to the assessment of English learners for identification as students with disabilities, you definitely want to go back to the resources included in Chapter 4, which were designed and developed specifically for that purpose, to aid in the assessment of dually identified students. And you'll find those linked here under Section 5 of the infographic so that you can refer back to these to really support your team's determination, from collecting parent information through the questionnaire, student information via the language use questionnaire, the English learner teacher, the transdisciplinary observations, the classroom observations, and all of those tools are listed here for you to access as you engage in this very nuanced and complex journey. Now, if you are part of an assessment team, These are great tools for you to have and share out with your additional members of your assessment team. If you are working within the scope of a TOSA or an educational leader, where you're working within a COP, a community of practice, a professional learning community, be thinking about what the assessment process and the requirements are, and how might these impact how it is that your sites are engaging in assessment practices. We want to ensure that we do in fact have the most recent, most accurate information that shows what the child can do, and not just engage in a deficit model where we just point out what the child cannot do. We're wanting to see patterns of strength and weakness, what the child can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, because that in and of itself then becomes our baseline as we monitor progress should the child meet eligibility criteria through culturally and linguistically appropriate special education assessment practices and processes, and in the implementation of the IEP. So in a nutshell, really what this guide, what this process is helping us do is to ensure that our instruments are valid, that we've evaluated specific areas of need, that they reflect aptitude, not sensory limitations or lack of English language fluency, that it's not related to limited school experiences or any of those extrinsic factors, and that our evaluation includes information related to enabling our students to participate, to be involved in, and to progress within the general education curriculum, or for our preschool students, for our littles, for them to participate in appropriate activities. And as a final note in relation to assessment practices and the role of the multidisciplinary team in reviewing and assessing and making a determination based on these reports, on these assessments, we want to ensure that we never rely on a single measure for eligibility, or never rule out eligibility because of a single measure. We want to ensure that we are utilizing clinical judgment and looking at the whole picture, and always cross-referencing information that the intake and the assessment yield. So again, multiple sources of information, formal and informal assessment, reports from the multidisciplinary team, from the ELD teacher, from everyone that is involved in the child's academic journey. Okay, couple of minutes, let's take it in. Now, Vanessa, you covered what the document says in relation to reflections on our process, things we could do to inform our existing process. But there's some information out there. And this is one of those bits of information that makes their way into our FAQs. Is it true that schools or student study teams must wait until a student has been receiving English learner services for 4 to 6 years, or is at least in 5th grade, so that they can fully develop English language skills before being referred to special education? What have you heard? What have they been saying? Is it yes? Is it no? True? False? Let me know in the chat. What do you think? Yes? No? What
We're
is it?
getting a lot of not true, false, no. Some say it's true, but it's false. If there's a suspected disability, you must assess. So far, those are the
All right, let's see. Survey says no. Ding, 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 ding. Disabilities occur in primary language, ELD, and across all contexts. Though it is required that assessors rule out that a student has a disability versus a language difference, We must ensure that we have skilled assessors that are trained in ELD and bilingual assessments and can then make a determination even if the student has not fully acquired English skills. On top of that, we have child find requirements, right? We have child find requirements that make us responsible for assessing all suspected areas of disability. Now, here's where it gets nuanced, right? And complex, because that's how we love things in special education, right? Nuanced and complex, full of gray. There is a big difference between making a referral solely based on how a student is doing academically and when we see that there is a true need for assessment immediately. When we're caught in this situation where we can't quite figure it out because we don't have enough information to determine if it's a language difference or a disability, here we want to tread a little bit more carefully, maybe pump the brakes a little if we're not sure what comprehensive ELD has looked like for the student, etc. However, if there is a need and that need for assessment to provide access to special education services is pressing, we must engage in that assessment process because we want to make sure that we get our students the supports that they need immediately, especially when we are in a situation where the student might be impacted by additional needs that might be related to being an unhoused individual, socioeconomics, right? So we want to ensure that although those are extrinsic factors, if a student is experiencing a potential disability and requires assessment to establish the services related to that, that all these other areas that are also impacting their access to academics are addressed as well through everything that is available for all general education students, as special education students are general education students first. So we want to ensure that when we develop that assessment plan, that the parents were well aware of how it is that the students are going to be assessed and that we consider the student's primary language in doing that, the home language in doing that, and in collecting relevant language-based information. Now, we're about 5 minutes from the end of our time together, but before we break out and you go back to the rest of your days, I want to provide you with some additional tools and resources that you may keep in your back pocket for another day. If you're looking to learn more about evaluation of culturally and linguistically diverse populations, look no further than this video from Dr. Sam Ortiz. We've linked this video, which is a full day video, so around 5 hours of content with downloadable resources there. The video is set up so that you can use it in a pause and play manner with the reference materials and slides included in the link there so that you can use it either for individual capacity building or collective capacity building of your teams. We've also linked the C-LIM matrix, which is a matrix that helps determine culturally and linguistically appropriate assessment practices. And on top of that, we've also included a link to the actual guide again, the culturally and linguistically appropriate special education assessment processes document, and this checklist. This checklist was developed by Dr. Montoya, who really put together a lot of the resources from the practitioner's guide and developed this self-assessment tool. This is a tool that assessors can engage in, pull out a report, a redacted report, your own report, whether you're working in a team, and answer a couple of yes/no questions. And upon completion, make the following determinations. Were all the elements addressed in the report? If yes, congratulations. That is fantastic. Some of you are total superstars in your field. And as so, how may you share the knowledge, expertise, and support to any other assessors that might have a need for additional support or guidance in those areas? And if not, what are some of those obstacles that kept the assessor from meeting each element? And how might we move forward with actionable next steps to ensure that those practices are in place? So, as I mentioned earlier, the content for a lot of the work that we do is based on the guidance in the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. And we've also developed resources to help you navigate some of these chapters, if not most of the chapters. Here we've linked the chapter 4 infographic where you can access the many links that are included in there that take you back to the document to explore those areas of need. Again, we know that not many of us have the time to sit down and read a 400-page plus document, but these interactive infographics provide you a visual to see a topic that you want to learn a little bit more of. Click in that section and it'll take you directly to the practitioner's guide where you can access all of those resources. So it is with that in mind that I share our collective commitment, Project Muse's collective commitment with you, to you, with our students, for our students, in this shared responsibility with parents, families, schools, and district professionals so that we can promote educational equity for all of our students, including our English learners and English learners with disabilities, to engage in the highest quality teaching and learning experiences. With that, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I know that 60 minutes is a short period of time to pack a lot of information in there, but let us know if you were missing some additional resources or you'd like some further time to connect and discuss some pressing topics. Our emails are here on this slide deck. Please feel free to connect with us, give us a call, send us an email, visit our website, and connect to us through that About Us page. We thank you for your time and your attention. Have a fantastic rest of your week.